has some kind of hormones which is liberated into it. So this particular gastric glands, which is a point of concern, or kind of like I would say like the person of this individual person of this particular region, which needs to be focused whenever you are going to study this. So you have to identify this gastric gland, where exactly they are placed and what they are functioning is kind of important thing. So we take this particular mucosa which is present in this region of the stomach. The mucosa means this particular thing have got three things. We have cells which is lining onto it, and under to it we have this lamina propria and this particular muscles which is present. The cells which is present in here, which looks like tall cells or tall columnar cells. So these particular tall cells which has a basal nuclei like this, they are present. We call them as tall columnar type of cells are there. In case of the esophagus, we've seen that these are flat cells. We call them as flat squamous kind of cells. Stratified layers were there. It may be having this particular one layer. We call them a simple kind of layer. We call them as simple columnar cells. Now, the remarkable feature of this particular simple columnar cells, which is present in this region, it has a secretory capacity. It secretes or liberates mucus on this particular region. So this particular mucus comes on top of this particular region, secreted by this particular cells or epithelial cells. So these particular cells, we have these columnar cells or column tall cells, which is capable of secreting some kind of mucus which is coating in top of this particular stomach. Now this particular mucus cell resting on this particular layer, we call them as lamina propria. So under to this particular cell, which is simple columnar cell, we have this particular space. We call this as lamina propria. Now lamina propria is fitted with this particular connective tissue structure. That means it is giving some kind of connective reinforcement structures to this particular region. Now this particular lamina propria out here is having kind of importance out this region. So what importance over here? We see this particular epithelium layer or this particular mucous layer go in deep structures. We call them as invaginations. So this particular columnar cells which you see that breaks down and dips down. So breaks down into some kind of invaginations. So this kind of invaginations, we call this as invaginations, which is present in here. So this epithelium is breached in this region and goes down, and this particular epithelium makes a kind of tunnel like this. So this particular tunnels, we call them as gastric canals. So this particular gastric canals is buried into the epithelium and goes in vaginations or becoming submarine, going inside and drops down into this particular space. This particular space we call them as LP or lamina propria. Now this particular invaginations out here, we give a special name to it. It looks like a column, we call them as gastric canal. So this gastric canal is also lined by this particular same columnar kind of cells, which is lining this particular inner to it, because we have the same tall cells which is present in it. Now this particular, within this particular lower limit, we call this as a base of this gastric canals are opened by some kind of glands which is present within this lamina propria. We call these glands as gastric glands. So they open into this particular gastric canal through this particular pits. We call this as a gastric pits. So this particular lamina propria have got these two features that need to be considered. One thing is this invaginations. These are invaginations or inburrowing of this particular columnar epithelium. They call them as gastric canal, and within this particular gastric canal, we see this particular secretory element or gastric glands which is opening in this particular regions, and whatever the gastric glands are producing are liberated within this particular gastric canal through this particular pit and goes outside to this lumen of the stomach. So this is the stomach lumen. That means food particle reaches out this particular region. Get it? The concept of it. So this particular concept of this particular lamina propria is having some kind of connective tissue, and this particular glands, tubular kind of glands, it looks like a tube, and it tubes may be single or may be having branch, like just like tree branches may have a kind of breakdown of these particular elements are there. So these particular elements which is present in here which is a kind of concern for us. Rest of this particular GI system in the stomach histology more or less the same. Under to it we have this muscle layer which is present in here. So we have a muscle layer which is present in here. Then we have the submucosa, doesn't have much of features. Then you have the muscle layer which is continuous with the submucosas, and then we have the external layer, adventitia. But the prime concern of this particular region holds in these regions, lamina propria and this epithelial cells over here, and muscular is mucosa, and then we just like have got more or less the same features like submucosa and the muscle layer. Outer and inner longitudinal muscles may have some other layer, doesn't have much of significance though, but have got this external features. So having said that, these are the general features. Now we just like to go through this particular PowerPoint to identify how this particular element is present within this particular GI structures. So whenever you are going to study this particular GI system, you have to just like go on identifying this particular lumen first, and then on the down to the lumen we have to identify the layer number 1, mucosa layer. Then within this mucosa we have to identify 3 elements if they are present in it. Within this particular elements we are going to see this particular region like epithelium, lamina propria, then muscular is mucosa, then submucosa, and then etc, etc. So this is the thing that we in a simple form we are going to identify. So this is what we have learned in the previous class. General structures of the GI system. 1, 2, 3, 4 layers are there. Mucosa, submucosa, muscular layer, and adventitia. These are the things. And this following this particular simple protocol, we are going to identify this particular the GI histology, which is point of topic today. We call them a stomach. So it's kind of like a bag-like structures which is present between esophagus and small intestine, have got parts which is general feature. Not going to talk about fundus region, pyloric region, and cardiac regions. We'll learn about this. This particular stomach have got like so many general features. That is for the concern for this particular theory class and as well as practical class. I'm not just taking time out it. I'm just straight away going to these particular structures or the internal structures of the stomach, which is related to the microanatomy. So if you see this particular stomach, say pick up any region. So in this particular regions, we are going to see these particular layers: mucosa, second is submucosa, muscular layer, external layer, muscular externa, which have got split into 2 or 3 layers of the muscles, and serosa. Now if you just like a look into the serosa, so stop taking these pictures. Try to learn from here. Everything is written on the book. So this muscular mucous layer have got these particular 3 segments. We have the cells which we call them as epithelial cells. How do the cell look like? That matters. Flat cells, column cells, cube cells, what does they exactly look like? We have to talk about the cells looks like this. And if they have any special function, like this one have capability of secreting mucus. So mucus secreting epithelium cells looks like column, we call them as columnar epithelium cells. Then deep to that we have this lamina propria, connective tissue. Out here is concern over here, they have got this particular glands which is present in it. Like how do the glands look like? They look like tubes. That's why you call them as tubular glands. They may have a single thing. That means they look like a single tube, or may have branch tubes like that. What do? They secrete so many things like mucus and hormones and enzymes, etc, etc. Then we have the muscle layer which is present in it. Then this particular layers likewise. So this is how they should be looking like. Now so this is the lumen side. Food petriol is present in this particular region. Now then we have this particular epithelium layer. Then this particular epithelium layer, once you have seen this particular, goes in infolding or invagination, burrowing deep. This particular burrowing deep things we call them as gastric canals, which is going into it, and opening of this we call them as gastric pits. Within this base of this gastric canals we see this particular round structure, we call them as glands. These glands opens eventually into this particular base of this particular gastric canals. So this particular secretions which is present in it is emptied within it, and as well as within this particular gastric canals we see that there are presence of the secretory elements. Then we go down out here, which is limiting this particular layer, which is this layer, which is the muscle layer of this epithelium, muscular is mucosa. Then we have the submucous layer, then we have the muscle layer, and this is the 4th layer, which is adventitia. This is how they are present in this. Now this region, you see that there is a demarcations between this region and this region. Cells present in this region different from here. So this is a a section taken from the gastroesophageal junction. That means this part is esophagus, this part is stomach. So this is a transition zone. We see this particular cells layered in stratified squamous region. So this region is becoming cubicle cells. That means this is the junction point or border area between this stomach and the esophagus, where from this particular tissues are picked up from. So this region we call, you already have learned, stratified squamous epithelium. That means stratified, that means many layers are there. Out here we call them a simple layer, that means one layer. We have cells there. It has a very high turnout rate, that means these cells turn out very quickly. That's why this is a simple layer and quickly shades off as this particular food material and this acid environment takes this particular cells away. But going down from here, but this particular thing should be looking like how you are seeing this histologically. But going to this particular histology of this particular stomach region and magnified on this particular region, you are going to see this invaginations on here and this lamina propria getting in here, and then we see this particular gastric canals which is getting into this particular gastric glands opening in here. This particular gastric canals which you seeing here in some regions have got different modified cells which is present in here. So this particular region we are going to study in here. So within this particular gastric canal, you see that this particular region, this is invagination, gastric pits which is getting in, and this is a bulge up. So this particular region we see that this is a tube like structure which is going in. So this is whatever it is getting in, making this particular canal like structures. And at the base of here we see these are the glandular elements. These glandular elements opens into this particular pits, produces the secretions, mainly mucus and etc. etc. Then we have this particular layer, we call this as muscular mucosa. Then you have the submucous layer, then we have the muscle layer, then we have the base layer. So this is magnified into 10x zoom. We are not going to see this particular zoom, 10x zoom in normal pictures. This is again super magnified. This is 100x zoom or more than 100. This is 40x, this is maybe just like a 100x zoom. So this particular thing which you call them as this particular gastric glands or gastric canals which is present in here, we are seeing in a magnified versions. So this gastric pits are there in the base of it. We have the surface mucous cells which is present in this particular region, and going down to this invagination gastric canals, we see this particular tubes can get longer. So this is looking like a tubular structure going down and reaching towards the base. Out here we have the glands which is also coming up on this into this. So if you see this particular cells which is present within this particular canal in some of the regions, like for example pyloric fundus region and the body region, they have some kind of different elements that we need to see. So this whole region we call them as gastric gland or gastric things which is present in it. Now within this particular regions we have the mucous region which is present in here, which has got like a epithelium, surface secreting mucous cells are there, and then we have this gastric pits which is present in it, and from this pit it is burrowed deep within this lamina propria, long gastric glands which is basically the gastric canals getting in. So this particular gastric canals which is present in here becomes a long pit like structure, and this particular long pit like structure fitted with some kind of secretory elements. So then we call them as long gastric glands, and within this particular long gastric glands, bottom of it we see this, there are presence of this gastric secretory element getting in. So this particular gastric glands we have to study a little detail of it. We'll coming into it. Then muscular is mucosa, same is there, submucosa, muscular is externa, and serosa is there. Now what present within this particular gastric glands? So if you take this particular gastric gland which is a narrow tube like structure which is getting in, it has some kind of specialized modified cells which is present in. On the top side, if you see this particular region, we see that there is a cells which is known as mucus secreting cells. Then deep to that we have the cells which is present in here, we call them as parietal cells. Then at the bottom we have the chief cells. And then even downside we have another cells which is known as the endocrine secretory cells and as well as stem cells. These are the four elemental cells that is present within this particular gastric glands. So this particular gastric glands have got four different kind of morphological different kind of or functional different kinds of cells are there. Some cells secrete this mucus, some cells secrete this particular element, we call them as the parietal cells which secretes this particular element, we call them as HCl or intrinsic factor. Some cells secrete the element, we call them as this particular chief cells which is responsible for secretions of the enzyme element, we call them as pepsinogen. And at the bottom here, we have this particular endocrine cells which secretes the gastrin, serotonin, etc., etc. These are the endocrine cells. And at the bottom, like on the base of this particular gastric glands, we have this particular element which is basically stem cells, replaces this particular gastric glands. So this particular element is point of concern. So this is a schematic picture, that's what you're seeing here. So this is the lumen side, this is the epithelium, and you see that this particular epithelium is invaginating, and this particular narrow thing which you are seeing here is basically the gastric pit which is communicating with these gastric canals. So these particular gastric canals, at the base of it, you see that there is a gland which is opening in it. So this whole thing has a lumen inside. Now as you see this particular cells which is lining in here near to this particular opening side, gastric pit side, as it drops down from here, we see that there are cells morphological changes happen here. So there are cells which is present within this particular gastric canal or gastric glands in this region, we call them as this region in the upper part. These cells secretes this particular element which is known as mucus. If you go down, then we see this particular cells which is known as secreting this element which is known as HCl and intrinsic factors. The cells which is present close to the bottom of it secretes this particular pepsinogen, we call them as chip cells. As you go down further down on here, we see this particular cells secretes this particular hormonal element, gastrin, serotonin, etc., etc. And at the base and the bottom in here, the cells which is basically reproducing this particular cells which is present in here, they are known as stem cells. So this particular 4 different structural cells are there. They are structurally and functionally producing some different actions. So this particular element we have to keep in mind. So what are the different kinds of cells this gastric glands has? That means this particular whole tube that you are seeing here, the whole tube which is present in here, we call them as the gastric gland, which is basically extension of this particular invaginations from this particular gastric epithelium. And there are 4 different types of cells are present in here. So 4 different types of cells. On the top cells, we call them as mucus secreting neck cells. So this neck region of this particular tube secretes this particular element. We call them as mucus secreting cells. Then we find this cells which is in blue over here. We call them as parietal cells. These parietal cells secretes the element which is known as Cassell's intrinsic factor and HCl, hydrochloric acid. Then we have these third cells which is known as chief cells. These chief cells are present in the lower third of the gland, which is secreting the element we call them as pepsinogen, which is the proteolytic enzyme that is coming out here. And then at the bottom or base we have these cells which is producing the hormones. What hormones? Gastric hormones and serotonin, histamine, they are present in it. And then we have this associated with this endocrine cells, we have these particular cells, we call them as adult stem cells. They are reproducing this particular the cells as this particular things has got high turnover, because this environment over here is very acidic and the cells cannot live for a long period of time. They need to be replaced as because we have a high turnover. So these particular cells have got like a likelihood of staying there. Say for example, this neck region cells turns out in 6 days, whereas this particular chief cells which is producing this particular pepsinogen which is having a lower turnout, say it can stay up to like a half of a year, 6 months nearly. So this particular acid secreting cells wears out in 3 months maximum. This endocrine cells, they has to be replaced by these particular 4 cells. How these particular cells will be replaced once they are dead? They need to be replaced by this particular breaking down or these particular divisions from this particular stem cells. So these particular stem cells divides and just like replace these particular high turnover cells. So surface mucosal cells, which is the quickest turnover cells, which is replaced by this like nearly 72 hours. So every 72 hours we get a new sets of cells which is secreting this particular mucus cells in these regions because of this environments which is present in it. This is our exam question. So in theory questions we ask these particular questions about this particular, describe a schematic picture of the gastric glands which is present and narrate about different types of cells which are present with this functional aspect of this, how they are producing out here. So you have to know what this mucus is doing, you have to know how this particular pepsinogen is functioning, you have to know what the HCl and intrinsic factors is doing, you have to know gastrin and serotonin what they are doing and this particular stem cell functions of it. So you have to narrow it down these particular regions of this particular gastric glands. Now, the second thing is that where you are going to see these gastric glands, in which layer of the stomach. So, in which layer out of the 4 you are going to see these particular gastric glands. So, in which layer this particular gastric glands you are going to see? Mucosa. So, how many layers we have? 4 layers. So, what are the layers? Above, down? So, this is present in the layer 1, first layer. Present in this particular first layer, and within this particular first layer, we are going to see these particular layers which is present. So, this particular schematic kind of pictures that you have to just like a see or just like a draw, and you have to just like explain these particular elements, whatever the things are present in it. Rest of the stomach is easy, doesn't have much of complex things which is present. Muscular is externa, they may have a 2 layers or 3 layers. Outer longitudinal, inner circular may have some kind of exceptions, but just like remember this muscular externa have got like same things like 2 layers, and this particular like stomach in here, this particular inner circular, outer longitudinal, we stick to that, and the adventitia layer which doesn't have much of changes, we have this particular like serosal layer which is present. So, remember this particular cells that is present in the gastric gland, and in which layer basically they are present, and what are the different functions and the different aspects of this particular stomach whenever you are going to see this particular histology. Like this chart matters, and this particular element matters in this region. So, fundus, pylorus and this body, they have got like a little bit modifications, just like do not go to understand this particular like changes which is present in the fundus region, pyloric region, etc, etc. So, just like in general in histology of this particular stomach, we just like talk about the fundus and the body and this region. So, fundus and the body is little different that of pyloric region, or little different from this particular cardiac region. So, we are not going to study each and each segment of the stomach likewise. So, in general this particular features which this stomach has, emphasizing on the gastric glands. So, whenever you are going to see this particular histology of the stomach or pictures of the stomach, we are going to see a picture like this in microscopes like this, projected like this. So, whenever you are going to see this, the rule is that you have to identify the lumen. Under the lumen, you are going to find the layer 1, which is the mucus layer, which has got 3 subdivisions like epithelium cells, which is present in here. Then we have this lamina propria, which is extensive out here, contains the gland, which is the hallmark for it. We call them as gastric glands, capable of secreting this. Then muscular is mucosa, which is present in here. Then is submucosa, more or less similar to this particular layer, which is muscle layer. External muscle layer, outer longitudinal, inner circular, and then we have the adventitia or the serous layer. This is how we are going to see, but again you are not going to see this picture like this, as we have 10x zoom there. So, we are going to see little less magnified versions of it. We have 3 microscopes focused in this particular region. Go and see this particular microscope, see these particular pictures first, try to identify this particular picture, and through the layers identify, then try to draw it and memorize this parts, whatever you are writing, on what you are writing, whatever you are writing. Okay. So, this is what you are going to see. 3 microscopes are there, split in 3 groups, and take the pictures of it. 3 of them, whoever can take good picture,